Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you are watching this webinar. Really excited to touch base with my friends and colleagues from Rutherford County Schools. And this is a kind of a review and just an update from our session on Evidence in Action 1 when Dr. Jones and I came back, I believe it was the 29th, 30th of August, and a chance to go through some review. And for any of the schools that just need a little bit more support on getting started, in our evidence gathering, this was just a chance to have sort of a recorded support that you could watch, you could review from time to time, maybe have some questions that you generate towards Trey or myself or Nancy, or maybe it just gives you just enough of a just second dose of some of the examples we shared that day to get started. And like any conceptual learning in a classroom anywhere, sometimes we need to hear it multiple times and just think about it for a while. So we wanted to develop a couple of these webinars that will help support you between Evidence in Action 1 and 2, and then certainly after, the support will never end. So this one is really kind of a focused opportunity. We're thinking about how to get some of our evidence started with some real concrete examples to begin your evidence gathering journey. I want to start off, as we should in any learning situation, with the learning intentions and success criteria. So 2 learning intentions that I've developed for this session are to understand how to pick a specific focus area. See a typo there on the screen, apologize for that. Related to visible learning, to begin to gather evidence, to begin your evidence gathering. And then determine how to develop a plan to collect evidence between now and September 20th, when I'm recording the webinar, and around Halloween. Certainly you've got a little bit of time after that. And to make what are called baseline evidence statements to prepare for EIA 2, which will come together on November 21st. You will know that you've met the learning intentions when you can do these 3 things. When you can articulate a specific set of specific focus questions you will use to begin to gather evidence with your students in terms of their view of becoming a more assessment capable and visible learner. If you remember, all the schools developed their posters that day around what a visible learner might be in their school. That might be a great place to start. Determine some actions to begin to gather that evidence around those questions you develop, either in a survey form, walkthrough, video diary format, or perhaps all 3. Know how to begin to consider how you will plan to be able to make some what we call baseline evidence statements by the end of your evidence collection around Halloween. Now, that 3rd point is what we really haven't introduced to anyone yet. It's a piece that comes in between EIA 1 and 2, so it's a chance to sort of preview that. And there'll be another webinar similar to this that just goes a little bit more broad brushstrokes that shows how we're going to look to come together sometime in late October, early November to check in and see where we're at so we can make the best use of our time when we come together Monday, November 21st. So again, just kind of highlighting the model that we've tried to put in place is we had our Evidence in Action Day 1 back on August 30th. And then we have the period of time where we're gathering evidence in the schools to prepare for Evidence in Action 2, which will then be used to guide your professional development planning. And I think a good place to start for all of us is how we are developing our visible learners. And certainly that will involve success criteria understanding, how the students view what a good learner is. Certainly we'll get into feedback and some of the other pieces, but this is really a great place to start. And I'm even going to highlight, and you should have an example of the case study that was attached to this webinar to see how other schools have kind of jumped into their journey, almost all of them, with really just getting into the conversations with the students via one-on-one conversations and walkthroughs, surveys, video diaries around their views of what really makes a good learner. So during this evidence gathering phase is what we're really trying to accomplish, how we make sure we can make some of these baseline evidence statements. Most common question that happens in any group that we work with is, where do we start? And as you see here, this simple quote, the starting point is where you think about your role. Now, a lot of us who have come together in EIA 1 are at the leadership role, the administrative role. And our job is to see what's the magnitude of the impact on the learning of our students. Well, before we can maybe even measure the impact, we have to see where we're starting. And so that's why this evidence gathering phase is simply to start to see where are we in terms of our learners and their understanding of a good learner, their understanding of what they'll do if they get stuck, their understanding of to be able to describe what they are learning. At times when students sometimes describe more what they're doing. But where we get started is a common challenge for a lot of schools and districts because there's a lot of evidence you could gather. And I'm hoping this webinar gives you a chance to think about what a focus area could be so that way you don't have that paralysis over analysis and you feel comfortable getting started. I love this quote from Crawford, and Michael Fullen has one very similar, but we won't identify the truth unless we go after it. And gathering evidence is a fact-finding mission. And so we just have to go after it. And certainly we want to do it in a way that's organized, that we feel good about the evidence we're gathering. But certainly if we're idle and we sit back, we're going to miss the opportunity to find some of the truth elements that will drive our actions moving forward. And as always, when we think about the mind frame of John Hattie as being evaluators, all of us need to consistently evaluate the impact we're having on the learners that we serve, whether that's at a classroom level, department chair level, administrator level at the building, district central office, superintendent. What's our role more importantly than any? Our role more importantly than any is to be evaluators of our own actions and their impact. And so now we think about the evidence that we could gather. And there's student data, there's staff surveys, there's focus groups, there's walkthroughs, there's a lot of things that we can certainly jump into. And so the overwhelmingness of it at times, in fact, I just did a webinar and wrote a paper with Karen Flores, who's very similar to the role Trey has in Rutherford. And part of the role in her district was, part of the focus of the paper was to kind of share how initially some of the schools, they didn't have as many as Rutherford County, they had about 23. So about half the size, but that there was a struggle early on for how to get started because there was so much potential evidence to gather. But to give you an idea of what evidence in the action 2 will look like is we'll come in that day with some baseline evidence that we've gathered between August 30th when we left or today, September 20th from here on forward to when we come together. And I'm pushing that Halloween date simply because then that still gives us 3 full weeks before we come back together. 3 full weeks to think, is that enough? Would we want to gather any more? And gives any school that gets a little bit behind certainly some leeway to catch up. But then these are the steps that we're going to follow through on that day. We're going to develop an aspiration statement, determine now what are our true focus areas from November 21st through probably late into second semester. Determine what knowledge and practice might need to be worked on. There might be some knowledge gaps with our leaders, with our teachers that we have to backfill, and some practices that we have to help each other develop and get strong at. We'll develop some measurable targets, determine actions and strategies, and develop a plan for monitoring. And certainly it will look very similar to any quality school improvement plan, but it'll be around making sure we're focusing on the adult learning and the adult actions to then impact students. But we really fall short in doing that if we don't have some quality baseline evidence gathered prior to coming together. So nice thing about the work at Rutherford, other districts I'm working in now, the window between EIA 1 and EIA 2 is kind of tight. We've got a lot of, at least a little bit of freedom, a little bit of flexibility is a better term, to not feel like we have to do it so quickly that we can't have a chance to think about it and do it well. And so a way to really get started is what do we know about our learners? To what extent do our learners exhibit the characteristics of an assessment-capable visible learner? And I'd like all of you, if possible, to go back to the posters and charts that you created that day, which we've placed into the folder. You can certainly access those. But where are your students now related to some of those traits, such as resilience, setting goals, having grit to get out of the pit, which was one of the quotes that came from one of the school tables. And a place to gather some very specific questions would be in the matrix. So I've just pulled here just a cut and paste of the visible learner part of the matrix, the part that we finished on day 1. And you can pull a couple specific examples. Can our students explain the assessments they take and tell them where they're at? If you remember the 4-box example with the red and the light blue and the yellow and green, where are we at with that? Can our students explain what they're learning and what their next steps are? Do our students feel it's okay to say they need help? Are they engaged in the learning process? Well, we'll find out if they're engaged in the learning process, possibly by asking them in any walkthrough observation, what are you learning and how will you know if you've learned it? If students can't respond to that question, it's pretty safe to say that they're not engaged in the learning process. They might be engaged in the doing process, in the completing process, but they should be able to articulate what they're learning and how they'll be able to articulate when they have learned it. So again, this is a little bit of a review, ways to gather evidence, and your EIA 1 manual had several examples throughout it with some details and some case studies, but focus groups, interviews, video diaries, and certainly the walkthrough. Anytime we come into a classroom, it's a great opportunity to ask students some of these questions that I'm mentioning and some that I'm going to highlight throughout this webinar. And it's a perfect time that we can gather 2 or 3 every observation. And we get 15 or so a day. Over the course of time, over the course of 4 or 5 weeks, really determine where we are. And if we're looking at an elementary school, do we see a difference between some of our lower level learners, not lower level, but lower grade level, or our intermediate level? Do we see a difference in 6 versus 7 or 8? Or do we see a difference in different disciplines? We're seeing more of that in science versus social studies or English. But there's a way that we can really begin to collect evidence simply through every walkthrough when we ask students simple questions and then kind of monitor their responses. And obviously do it through a survey, certainly can do it through a video diary. And if you have a chance shortly to read through the case study that I've attached, you see an example of both video diary as well as classroom walkthrough evidence gathering. So the case study that you have really comes a very authentic example from a district in Iowa I was working with. And they began their visible learning evidence gathering journey by gathering evidence related to what the students viewed a good learner to be. So the principal simply taped approximately 80 students and asked them a simple question. What makes a good learner a good learner? And as you see in your case study, if you've had a chance to read it, but about 85% of the students responded with some form of compliance-based answer. Sit up straight, speak when spoken to, you do your work, but they really weren't related to true learner traits. Not that students can't sit up straight and not that they can't be respectful at all times and respect the teacher's authority, of course, but those aren't necessarily traits that are going to help them learn. I think we all know that the learning, the inquiry, the questioning, the seeking feedback, the acting on their own feedback is what really drives true learning. So then, in addition to that, so they had 2 forms of evidence. They had the video diary and then the school and the teacher leaders, because they had some teacher leaders who would do observation, not observations as much as just walkthroughs, instructional coaches, not in evaluative mode, but they continued to gather evidence by asking all students 2 questions, asking during walkthrough several students 2 questions. What are you learning? And how will you know when you've learned what you're supposed to? Simple questions, fair questions, and ones that can garner some really good evidence as to whether or not the learners, over a course of time, when we ask a good proportion of them, how they're responding to those questions. So from September 12th to October 31st, this was last fall, actually it wasn't October 31st, it was October 30th because I believe Halloween fell on a Saturday. But it was almost during the same time frame we're looking at here. The administrative team conducted approximately 114 walkthrough observations that allowed them to pose these questions to students. And here were the results. What are you learning? So you see the first number, what they were able to describe what they were learning. They would describe more of what they were doing. It was more completing the task. What are you doing? What are you learning? Well, I'm doing my worksheet, I'm completing my puzzle, I'm completing my assignment. 11% weren't able to respond to the question at all. Question number 2, how will you know when you've learned what you're supposed to for that lesson? About 21% were able to respond that they were explain what they would know, what they were learning or focusing on. Then the next ones were more about finishing the task. I will know when I've learned it, when I've completed my 27 problems, when I've completed my 4 boxes, when I've completed my worksheet. 10% referred to, well, the teacher's got to tell me. And so it was related a little bit to the grade, a little bit to, well, I won't know if I've learned it until the teacher tells me, as opposed to having an understanding of the success criteria. And then 14% simply couldn't describe at all what they were learning or what they were focusing on. And again, you have this in your case study. Certainly during any of these webinars, if you need to pause them, if I go fast and you could kind of go through the evidence and read it, just feel free to pause the recording. So now what we're looking at, once that happens, is making what we call baseline evidence statements. So from the evidence here that we've gathered, if that was your evidence, this is what you will bring to evidence action 2, which we're looking to getting somewhere close to this by Halloween. So if we need to make any tweaks, we can do so. So they made these baseline evidence statements. The first one is a more generalized relative statement. Teacher clarity, student understanding of success criteria is currently low in our school. That's a statement, but to back that up, just over 10% of the students can currently describe what they're actually learning. And over half, the responses were related to them knowing if they were completing a task versus actually what they were expected to learn. So again, your baseline evidence statements will almost always start here with sort of a relative, not a generalization, but a quality strong inference that is backed up with something measurable. Out of the number of observations we asked, certainly we can make that determination. Now, one thing that will happen in any school possibly is when we begin to talk about sharing the evidence, and this happened in several districts I worked with, and this is very common, that focusing on learning, if it hasn't been the culture, we usually get results like this, and it's disheartening to an extent. Well, at times, there could be the possibility in your school, at least there have been in some that I've worked in, well, we're asking the wrong students. Well, we asked 104, we asked 2 or 3 students in 114 observations, and we're close to 300. If we are asking the wrong students, we're asking a lot of the wrong ones. So one thing that I want to mention is the evidence initially might not be what we would like it to be, and that's fine. This is going to help us act. But at the same time, to consider waiting till we get a lot of our evidence gathered before we begin to share it, so that way we don't have any of the defensiveness mechanism come in, because that's not what this is about. And as Dr. Jones has said, it's not to name, shame, and blame. It's to identify a place to ask better questions and to begin to determine some quality actions. Some other thoughts to possible questions to ask students verbally, on a survey, and a video diary. As I've mentioned already, what makes a good learner a good learner? And I would encourage you to compare your current responses of what your students might give you to that to what your team created and developed on your draft posters during EIA 1. Do you feel it's safe to make mistakes? And then why do you say that? Why do you say it is or it isn't? Certainly that's one that we would want to ask in a verbal situation, in a focus group, not necessarily on, you could do it on a survey, certainly, but to not just have it be a yes or no, but then why? We can garner much more information that way. Because if they say, do you feel safe? Yes, because my teacher lets me make up my test. That's good, but I don't know if that's really getting us into, I feel safe making mistakes because my teachers taught me mistakes help me learn. So that secondary response, that qualitative response, will probably help garner a lot more evidence around how students are viewing that statement. And certainly that is one that comes right off the matrix. And how do you use your assessment or your test results to know what you need to learn next? So the students realize that their assessment results, their grades even, should be a place for them to know where to go next, not just that it's the end-all be-all, that it's an ending evaluation, whether I've got it or I didn't. Do they use their results to know what to do next? And again, some of these last two here, the bullet points 2 and 3, that might be next level. If you started just with the ones I've shared around what makes a good learner, or asking students those questions simply in every walkthrough, you're going to have some really solid evidence to make some quality baseline evidence statements to bring back to. And if they are related to what I'm learning, do I understand that? It's a great place to realize or to make the emphasis on success criteria understanding with our staff as a place to start with professional development and planning, which will happen when we come back together November 21st. I wanted to finish with our success criteria again. Articulate specific focus questions you'll begin to gather evidence with your students in terms of becoming an assessment capable visual learner. Hopefully you've got some ideas on how you could do that. Determine some actions on how to gather evidence. Hopefully now you've got a chance to think about, do we want to do this in a survey or a walkthrough? And then that third point is how to consider how you'll plan to make those baseline evidence statements. That third success criteria point is, I don't want to use the word a softer one, but it's just, I want you to at least have an idea of how to begin to think about, okay, this evidence has to help me be able to do that in approximately 6 weeks' time. Does that help you have a better understanding of what your plan might be? As always, very excited as Dr. Jones is. I didn't include his email on here, but certainly everyone has it. But both of us are excited to help. I just took the lead on getting this webinar going. But if you have any questions, as always, feel free. You don't have to go through anybody else. Just come straight to myself or BR, dave.nagel@corwinlearning.net. There's my Twitter handle, my cell phone. Please don't hesitate to reach out or ask questions or anything at all. We can help you out with this journey. And with as many schools, over 40, as we're excited to be working with in Rutherford County, schools are going to be at different levels. And some are ready to move on and need some support, and some are struggling on how to get started, and they need a little bit of support and focus by all means. And certainly Bill Maurer, who's been on site, he's more than willing to help all of us on this Corwin team. Want to do our very best to make sure you feel at any time when you're needing support or help, you know where to reach out to get it. We'll look forward to talking with everyone soon. Hope you have a great rest of your week. And please contact us with any questions. And we look forward to talking with everyone soon. Have a great rest of your day.